And after a trip around the Kerbolar system, there we have them, the two first modules of the Dres Rings space station coming together. But how did I get there? Well, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Pietro, and today in this video I'm gonna show you how I started building a space station inside the rings of Dres. As you can see in the video in the background, I built a core for the space station with some reaction control thrusters, some reaction wheels, the monopropellant, the hydrogen for the nuclear engine that I decided to use, since it's one of the most efficient that we have in KSP, and then obviously also something to produce power, since we're gonna be inside of rings with lots of debris around. I opted for RTGs instead of solar panels that could be punctured by micro meteoroids. And then nothing, I added a transfer stage, I added a kick stage with a very big mammoth, and then I doubled it up with two boosters. Again with the mammoth. This is because I don't like using SRBs because they really impact performances on my poor laptop, therefore I went for them, and I did not even use the asparagus staging. I didn't go for the fuel crossfit from the boosters to the central core, which would make everything more efficient, just because that would also impact a lot on performances. I also did some management of the thrust to not have a too big thrust to weight ratio that will give me a lot of acceleration and therefore more fight against the drag inside of the atmosphere, and I aimed at obtaining a 1.25 of thrust to weight ratio for the launch. You also saw me there adding some struts and some serpetrons that are pointing slightly downwards but also outwards with respect to the boosters, therefore when they are gonna detach and activate during the separation of that stage, they are gonna help with the separation without risking to make the boosters hit the central core. Here you see me doing one of the most important things in KSP, which is checking the staging and making sure that everything activates at the correct moment. And now it's the time of getting to the launch window for Dres. Since in KSP2 at the point of recording we do not have an automatic transfer window planner, we need to rely on the information that we can find on the internet. The transfer window for Dres is when the angle between Kerbal and Dres is of about 82.06 degrees, and this is what I'm trying to obtain. You can find on the internet images that people uploaded with the correct windows, and since we were more or less aligned there, well, time to take off. So let's go in the countdown and proceed with the launch into an equatorial orbit around Kerbin. Obviously a little bit of lag. You can see the performances with Riva Tuner at the top right of my screen, around 18-19 FPS, which would be way lower if I were to use the fuel crossfit or if I were to use also the solid rocket boosters. Instead, like this, we have a decent performance. If you look at the time at the bottom of the screen, it's sped up because obviously I didn't want to bother you with the entirety of the launch, since it's as standard as always. We try to stay vertical for as long as possible so that our rocket does not flip out in the lower atmosphere, and then when we start getting high enough we can slowly but steadily begin a gravity turn. Here I had some instabilities. The rocket was aiming a little bit off course with respect to the eastwards direction for some reason. I don't know what was going on, but I managed to keep it stable enough to get into orbit. Here you see me dropping off the boosters, the fairing, and then flattening out the rocket, pointing along the horizon, trying to burn horizontal as much as possible to not rise too much the AP, while instead rising as much as possible the PE, the pericenter, the periapsis of our orbit, staging, and then getting ready to coast to the AP using some time warp, and there again burning along the horizon to make a circularization burn, and then starting the planning of the maneuver to get to Dres. And here during the burn you can see that I switched to the map view and the rocket starting flipping and spinning out of control. It's not for style points, it's just that the rocket decided to do that when I was in the map view, so it took me some more time to get into our more or less circular orbit, which I didn't even circularize that much. It's 324 by 200 just because I had too much thrust, too much delta V in the first stage, and I wanted to make one single burn with that, since, you know, that's a little bit more realistic. And yeah, so we got into this kind of orbit that is suboptimal, but here we are managing the maneuver plan to get a transfer window to Dres. It took me some time to understand where to put it, but obviously it's for the majority it's a prograde burn, and then also we add as soon as possible, so during this burn, a change of inclination, a plane change during this maneuver to take advantage of the fact that we are making one single burn, and so optimizing the fuel that we use instead of doing two different burns to do the two different maneuvers, which, you know, by the Pythagoras theorem, it's gonna mean that we are gonna have two different vectors, and so their value is gonna be bigger than the total value that instead we can use in delta V by making this kind of maneuver in this situation. I didn't bother to get in the same exact plane, also because I couldn't from where I was, since Kerbal in this moment was not passing through the plane of intersection, to the line of the intersection of the planes of the two different planets. Therefore I can just optimize getting to those 4.4 degrees and try to make my orbit be tangential to the orbit of Dres, since if we are gonna intercept Dres at our apoapsis, we are gonna be at the lowest possible relative velocity, which is gonna make the capture inside of its sphere of influence, of its gravity well, the easiest, because we're gonna require less delta V to enter into an orbit around Dres. Here we are at the second maneuver plan moment, in which we have to change instead the inclination, so we make the maneuver plan at the intersection between the two planes, meaning that there we can change the inclination and put ourselves in the same orbital plane as Dres. Again, there is some managing of the other direction, so a little radial in, a little radial out, and same with prograde and retrograde, trying to get the intersection with Dres as close as possible. We had two intersections, meaning that we were going above the orbit of Dres and then emitting it while going up and then while going down, as you can see right now. And my objective is try to get one intersection or of the two, or just one single one that has an entrance in the sphere of influence, as we just got there, so we can aim at the direction of this maneuver, time warp using the in-game feature to get to the maneuver plan location, burn in that direction, and hopefully getting the correct execution down to the millisecond or to the millimeter per second of delta V that is gonna give us the intersection that the game promised us. Unfortunately, it was not like that, so a little bit more forward in our trajectory I had to add another maneuver plan, and again play with radial in, radial out, and also prograde and retrograde, and also normal and antinormal, so changing a little bit the plane, changing a little bit the axis of the nodes of our orbit to try and obtain another intersection. And here you see me doing this management while focusing off the planet. You can just right click and select focus on Dres, trying to make the entrance and exit from the sphere of influence be as lined up as they could to the diameter, let's say to one of the diameters of the sphere of influence, meaning that I would pass as close as possible to Dres, which is my objective, since we want to get down to the rings of the planet, which are quite close, quite a lot inside of the sphere of influence. So therefore time warp again after having performed the burn with our entrance and exit in the sphere of influence, which are very, very lined up with the planet. And here again, adding another maneuver plan. This time we just gonna burn for the majority in the retrograde direction, which is gonna take us in a circular orbit or in an elliptical orbit, whatever we wanna do around the planet. Here you see me, I overdid it a little bit, so I had to go back in the other direction, and I wanted to stay in a high elliptical orbit to minimize the delta V that is required for the change of inclination. In fact, the closer you are to a planet, so the faster you are going, because that's how orbital mechanics works, then when you're gonna need to make a change of inclination, you are gonna have to burn for longer, use more delta V, since the entity of the vector that you are trying to turn around to change the inclination of your orbit is higher, is bigger, since you are traveling at a faster velocity. So let's time warp towards the periapsis of our orbit around Dres. There we are gonna perform a retrograde burn following the maneuver plan, using the last amount of delta V available in our second stage of the transfer vehicle, and then decouple it and reversing the control from our core of the space station, turning it around, since we have the nuclear engine on top of it, because obviously this made our vehicle more stable, since we didn't have a part going from a medium size to small to then medium back again inside of our upper stage. And there we go, ignition of the nuclear engine, so pushing with that hydrogen as fast as possible, getting all of it in the opposite direction with respect to where we want to go, so being captured around Dres. And then I can look at the map view and making so that the planes of the rings and of our orbit are aligned, therefore putting the camera in the line of intersection of the two planes. And there we are gonna make a change in inclination, burning in the normal direction in this case, slowing a little bit down so that we are sure to not escape back into orbit around Kerbal. And we are gonna put ourselves eyeballing it, obviously, since there is no way of precisely targeting the rings of the planet in more or less the same plane. In fact, you can see me here going then to proceed lowering the pericenter and making it reach more or less the height of the rings, which are at about 300 kilometers from the surface of Dres. In fact, they span from 285 kilometers to 300 more or less. Here I'm gonna target an orbit with a PE at around 290, which is inside of them and in a position which you can clearly see if you get to the correct inclination that you are inside of them exactly. Yeah, so time warping there, performing the burn and trying therefore to get the PE at the correct height. And so performing the retrograde burn now, and then once our PE is at that height, again try to check the intersection between the planes, again there make a burn in the normal or anti-normal direction based if our orbit is crossing, going upwards or downwards the plane of the rings. Here you can see that I'm using the map view to try and check if the plane was more or less the same after that burn, so that the maneuver plan was set up at the best of my capabilities. And then again we can lower a little bit the PE so that it is at 292 kilometers from the surface of Dres. There you see that's the range in which the rings are, so we are getting closer. Let's perform again this burn and then obviously continuing to go down to the PE, getting our final first view from inside the rings of Dres, from which we are gonna perform another burn. This time it's gonna be actually a circularization burn to take our AP, our apoapsis, the highest point of our orbit, also inside of the rings around Dres, with the maneuver plan that you can see me planning exactly now. And with the magic of KSP and the manipulation of time that we can have, here we are inside of the rings of Dres, or actually just a tiny little bit above them right now. And here you can see me messing around with the camera that was in some weird position. We are actually crossing now the rings and we see that they are actually made of some kind of powder and also lots of rocks. They are probably the result of a gigantic impact that we can see around the equator of the planet. There is a very big crater and a crest, a rim going all around Dres, and we discovered something weird here right now inside of the rings, that they are apparently orbiting in a retrograde orbit. In fact, it looks like as we have a very high relative velocity from them, and they are at our same orbital height but moving in the opposite direction. What's going on here? Well, I tried to get myself also into a retrograde orbit, which will mean looking from the north pole of Dres, going in a clockwise direction, and still I could see them having a relative velocity with respect to my spacecraft. Therefore, there is some kind of magic that makes them go in the same direction, which is not a prograde orbit, so it's not in the same direction in which also the planet rotates, and they have always a different velocity with respect to the one that you have while being at the same orbital height around the same exact planet. Here you can see me struggling with trying to have my orbital plane be exactly the same of the rings and doing these burns here and there while I was crossing inside of them to try and make my plane the same exact. So while I was crossing the plane going down, I was burning in the north direction, so in the normal direction, to try and make my orbit rotate in that way that it was aligned with the plane of the rings, and then obviously also vice versa. So while crossing the plane while going up, I was pointing down with my rocket, so pointing anti-normal to try and again flatten out my trajectory. But it was time, after more or less having it into a decent orbit, of going back to the VAB and start to build a habitation module, which also was the node module of our space station. It's gonna be actually the node module of our space station. So there you can see me putting a hitchhikers module and then adding some components. I went for the smaller ones this time, so to reduce the mass that our spacecraft, that this component of the space station was gonna have. Here you can see me adding the multi-point connector with lots of docking ports on all the sides, so that we may as well add some more modules in the future, and also to dock with crews and then dock with the lander that's gonna take the crew down to the surface of Dres. Here you can see me rotating around the module just to make sure that I can have the reaction control thrusters on the axis, along the axis that I like to have, and not having them bothering the ladder at the sides of the rocket. I simply doubled the rocket by holding Alt and clicking onto it from the other spacecraft, and I was building it in the same exact workspace. Then I decided to change and so throw away, let's say, the previous spacecraft and simply giving another name to the workspace and to this new rocket and new module. Again, I decided to put a maneuvering stage with a nuclear engine, so hydrogen tanks and also nuclear electric generators, so that we don't have the problem of the panels. This is going to be discarded as soon as we are going to dock with the main module of the space station, adding some struts to keep everything stable, also because this time we have our spacecraft getting tighter before of just simply the engine, which is gonna make the stuff a little wobbly. Here, since I copied the vehicle, I had some problems with the struts because they were always referring to the main structure, so I was a little bit regretting of not having simply changed the payload and then saved, instead of having copied and worked in the same workspace. So here you can see me building the fairing. I already checked the entirety of the staging of our rocket to make sure that everything activates at the correct moment. Then we can just save and proceed to the launch. What happened during the launch? Well, the rocket flipped out of control. The instability caused by how this module was built, and maybe me trying too early to make a gravity turn, resulted in the rocket exploding. Therefore, I added, as you can see here, some winglets at the bottom, some stabilization wings, let's say, and also a few vernier thrusters on the second stage, and then we went for the launch again. What happened this time? Well, this time the problem was the fairing. There we have it, deployment and the spacecraft breaking apart. I don't know why it was set in double symmetry and not in 4-time clamshell, and one of the two parts just decided to grab onto my spacecraft and make it break apart. The second time that I tried instead, I put the 4-time clamshell and it flew forwards at speeds unimaginable from Kerbal kind. For some reason it worked, but okay, we don't bother about that, and we can just go on again, getting into an interplanet transfer window and then changing our plane, making some maneuvers from the axis of the nodes and trying to have an interception with the planet of Dres that we obviously set as target, using our second stage of the rocket to perform this maneuver of change of plane and get ourselves close to this encounter. Again, we are gonna need to make more maneuvers, more adjustments, this mid-course correction, which is what happens also in reality, to try and make our entrance and exit in the sphere of influence of Dres lined up so that they pass through the planet. Here you can see me time warping while having as target the spacecraft, like the module of the station. Therefore it was all wobbly and everything. The maneuver did not get me inside of the sphere of influence of the planet. Here I had to make therefore another one to be able to get that, and then finally we got our intersection. We are gonna time warp until we get down to Dres after having performed the maneuver. Well, actually I guess it's up to Dres since it's further away from the sun with respect to Kerbin. And here we are, we entered the sphere of influence of the planet, and now it was a time of struggling against the game that didn't want to let me create a maneuver plan. Then I noticed that the window of the maneuver plan was up there at the bottom, at the top of the screen, and so from there I was actually able to start and performing it. And now what we want to do is set as target the core module of this space station and try to move around our orbit. So I went radial in all the way so that I took my orbit, my trajectory on the correct side of the planet to take the new module on a prograde orbit, which is the same kind of orbit that the module of the station, the core of the station, is following as we set up previously, and then tweaking it a little bit around by slowing down to lower the PE and also changing the inclination to reduce the difference that it has with respect to the one of the core of the station. So after some more tweaking, like going radial in because I went too much radial out in the other direction, which was radial in before, and then yeah, the stuff is kind of confusing, but well, we had a trajectory that was more or less okay for this first preliminary burn, and so I decided to go for it, aim in that direction and perform it. The rocket was spinning a little bit out as it was doing before while on the map view. Why? I don't know, it knows it, we do not, and so I had to go back in the view outside of the map, which meant that I could not check how the trajectory was going, but I was happy with what I obtained previously until checking the map. Well, we'd obtained an orbit completely different from the one that the maneuver plan promised us. Was it because I performed it 25 minutes too early? It might as well have been the case, but you know, when also you create a maneuver plan so far away from the planet, it might be that just a tiny little bit too much to one direction or the other is gonna make everything bad. Therefore it was okay like that. It just took me some radial in burn doing by myself and then creating a maneuver plan to finally adjust the height of the orbit and also make sure to be captured inside an orbit around the Dres and changing the inclination. Here you can see that the intersection position changes over time and that I am managing the size of my orbit until I'm not gonna get an intersection in the intersection of the planes, and that is at a manageable speed, therefore with an elliptical orbit of myself with respect to the one of the core of the station that is not too big, so that the relative velocity when we are gonna meet is not gonna be so high. So now that we have a capture burn set up, we can just aim in the indicator direction with our spacecraft, time warp to when it's gonna be the time of performing this kind of burn, which is gonna be very close, if not inside of the rings of the planet. And from here again we create another maneuver plan, this time to change the inclination and take it down to practically zero or close to there. That's our intent with this burn here, and take the PE at the same height as the orbital height of the spacecraft that we try to dock to. This kind of docking is different from the one that we make when we are launching from a planet and trying to dock to something that is already in orbit, because there we go usually for the direct ascent, similar to what was done during the Gemini program, for example, in which they were trying to dock or to perform the rendezvous directly with the target during the first orbit from the launch, or what we do where we go, for example, to a space station around Kerbin, in which we launch in a slightly higher or slightly lower orbit and catch up regularly to it orbit after orbit. Here we simply try to manage the dimensions of our bigger orbits, since we are coming from outer space and we are trying to go in a lower orbit, to make sure that our two orbits cross each other at a manageable distance and at a manageable relative velocity, which is what you can see me doing here, setting up for the next encounter in the next orbit. You see that there we have that encounter. I'm managing it now with the reaction control thrusters to try and have precise maneuvering of it. In fact, you can see it's all wobbly because these are the small jet pulses that the RCS gives me. For some reason there the debris goes on a trajectory that does completely make not any sense at all, but okay, game. We are not gonna bother with that. And then getting closer and closer, we have a very low relative velocity, about 17 meters per second. We can just burn relatively to the target, in which I obviously switched to the relative to the target velocity by clicking 2 times on the velocity indication there on the nav ball, and then getting closer and closer. Here I did some not very good managing of my velocity. I really liked to use a mod in KSP1 that showed me where I was with respect to the target in an optimal way for docking. In KSP2 this is not a feature. I should wait for the mod to be released. Here I'm messing a little bit around. I did not want to switch to the other vehicle and turn it around to help me with the docking, but then I just decided that it was easier to directly switch to it, control from the docking port, target the docking port of the other, and dock with it. Also because in the core stage the RCS are set at the correct height of the center of mass, so it's way more stable with respect to what the other vehicle is, since there I have reaction control thrusters on the center of mass of the module and not on the transfer vehicle. But in any case, here we are, we docked. We started the building of the station around Dres inside of its rings, and everything was fine up to now until the Kraken attacked. As soon as the two spacecrafts, as the two modules docked together, the game decided to make them spin around. And so here I tried to troubleshoot it, I tried to time warp to stop the rotation, I tried to decouple that stage, I tried to activate the RCS, deactivate the SAS, ask to hold, prograde, retrograde, something like that, but there was no way to make this stable. So I decided, okay, let's leave this stuff there, let's try to switch to another vehicle, let's try and deorbit this vehicle here. Unfortunately, without reaction control thrusters and without an SAS module, and since the nuclear engine doesn't have a gimbal, you cannot control it, and then it started spinning out of control too, and then the station was on a completely different orbit with respect to the one in which I left it, and then time accelerating, time warping was making it spin all around out of control, and then it started stretching, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get to the center of the planet, because I don't know why I passed through the surface of the planet, and then I'm gonna get flung out into interplanetary space, into interstellar space, but the game decided that no, it was gonna break apart and it was gonna mission fail and everything was gonna have to be restarted from zero. No, luckily enough, no, I had a quick save, and so I could just reload the quick save, and luckily enough that took me to a condition in which the space station was stable, it was controllable without any problems, and so I do not have to remake the 5 hours of gameplay that it was to get up to here. And so we have it here inside of the rings, more or less. Here in fact I'm gonna do some more managing of the orbital inclination of the two modules, because docking them together and making those tiny little maneuvers with the reaction control thrusters took me outside of the plane of the rings, which by the way right now you cannot see them well. Apparently reloading the quick save made the details change. They went down to a lower quality for some reason, therefore the rings and all the rocks and the powder are not there. So yeah, I hope that the next time restarting the game and setting the graphics details to the correct value, so to high, it's gonna make them respawn. And nothing, that's it for this episode. We started building the space station. In the next episodes we are gonna continue the construction, send some Kerbals to help with the construction, and maybe also send them with a lander on the surface of Dres. I hope you enjoyed the video, that you maybe learned something, that you may consider subscribing. I wish you a good day and see you all the next time. Bye bye.